Hi. At 74, Kurt Russell is still widely seen as one of Hollywood's great success stories. A man who entered the industry as a child, survived every shift in fame, every change in taste, every brutal turn of the spotlight, and somehow emerged without the public collapse that destroyed so many others. No scandals that defined him. No humiliating fall from grace. No desperate attempts to stay relevant. Just a long career, a stable private life, and an image of quiet strength that never seemed to crack. From the outside, it looks like the perfect ending. But the tragedy of Kurt Russell isn't found in what went wrong. It's found in what never went wrong enough for anyone to notice the cost. Because when someone survives everything, the world assumes they never suffered. Kurt Russell didn't grow up chasing fame. He grew up inside it. Long before he had the chance to decide who he wanted to be, he was already being watched, judged, approved, or replaced. Sets became his classrooms. Directors became authority figures. Applause replaced comfort. And at an age when most children are still learning how to feel safe, he was learning something far more dangerous, that being valuable meant being useful. That lesson shapes a person in ways that last forever. It teaches you discipline, control, emotional restraint. You learn not to complain, not to break down, not to inconvenience the people who depend on you. You learn how to smile even when you're exhausted, how to deliver even when you're empty, how to keep going because stopping feels like failure. And over time, you become known for one thing above all else. You become the strong one. Kurt Russell built a reputation as someone who could handle anything. He didn't implode when the industry shifted. He didn't disappear when trends changed. He didn't chase attention or beg for validation. He adapted quietly, consistently, professionally. Hollywood trusted him because he never caused problems. He showed up. He did the work. He carried himself like someone who didn't need saving. But strength, when practiced for decades, stops being a choice. It becomes an expectation. People often point to his decades-long relationship with Goldie Hawn as proof that he won at life. And what they built together is rare, no question. But relationships that last that long are not held together by romance alone. They survive through endurance, through compromise, through silent sacrifices that never make headlines. Someone always becomes the emotional anchor. And Kurt was always that person, the steady one, the grounded one, the man who didn't fall apart, which sounds admirable until you realize what that role quietly demands. It demands that you carry weight without showing strain, that you absorb stress so others don't have to, that your pain remains invisible because acknowledging it would disrupt the image everyone relies on. So you don't talk about fear. You don't talk about exhaustion. You don't talk about doubt. You manage it. You contain it. You move forward. Look closely at the characters Kurt Russell became famous for. Even when he played outlaws, anti-heroes, or morally gray men, there was always an internal code, a sense of responsibility, a willingness to take the hit so others could stand. Those roles weren't just performances. They were extensions of a man who had learned, very early on, that his job was to endure. Hollywood rewards men like that. Men who don't ask for help. Men who don't make their struggles visible. Men who can be relied on to hold everything together while the world keeps moving. But time doesn't care about reliability. As the years pass, the industry grows quieter. The calls slow down. The scripts change. The roles become fewer, not because you failed, but because you aged. And for many actors, this is where panic sets in. Desperation, public spirals, loud attempts to prove they still matter. Kurt Russell didn't do that. And that's where the heartbreak deepens. Because when you never built your identity around fame, you can't blame fame when it fades. You're left facing a far more unsettling question, alone and unprepared. If I'm not needed the way I used to be, who am I now? At a certain age, tragedy doesn't arrive with scandal or shock. It arrives quietly. It arrives as awareness. The awareness that time is no longer abstract, that strength has limits, that the people you love are fragile, that the role you've played your entire life may no longer fit the body you're living in. And for someone who spent decades being the dependable one, the protector, the rock, that realization can be terrifying. Because rocks don't ask for comfort. They don't lean. They don't admit fear. They just hold everything up until one day they feel the weight all at once. At 74, Kurt Russell stands at that silent crossroads where the world still sees a legend, but the man himself feels the accumulation of everything he carried without complaint. The birthdays that feel heavier, the silences that last longer, the understanding that strength alone can't stop time. The tragedy isn't what happened to him. It's what he never allowed himself to feel while it was happening. And the most painful chapters of his story are still the ones no one hears him say. The problem with becoming strong too early is that you never learn how to be anything else. Kurt Russell learned responsibility before he learned vulnerability. He learned discipline before he learned how to rest. By the time he was old enough to understand what pressure really was, pressure already felt normal. And when something feels normal, you stop questioning whether it's fair. As a child actor, Kurt didn't have the luxury of anonymity. Mistakes weren't private. Growth wasn't gentle. He was watched while he was still figuring out who he was allowed to be. And when you're praised for professionalism at an age when you should be praised for curiosity, something subtle breaks. You stop asking what you want, and you start asking what's expected. That mindset followed him into adulthood. Kurt Russell became known as someone who didn't need reassurance, someone who didn't need hand-holding, someone who could take criticism without flinching and rejection without resentment. But what people didn't see was the internal trade being made every single time he chose control over expression. Because every time you suppress a feeling, you don't erase it. You store it. And storage has limits. For decades, Kurt moved through Hollywood like a man who had already accepted impermanence. He didn't cling to stardom. He didn't chase youth. He didn't panic when the industry shifted its attention elsewhere. That calm made him look wise, grounded, immune to the insecurity that eats so many actors alive. But calm can be deceptive. Sometimes calm isn't peace. Sometimes it's containment. When you build your identity around being reliable, you start measuring your worth by how little trouble you cause. You pride yourself on being low maintenance, on being easy, on not needing much. And slowly, almost invisibly, you train the people around you to expect that version of you forever. They don't ask if you're okay. They assume you are. They don't offer support. They assume you don't need it. And you don't correct them because you don't want to become a burden. That's how strong men disappear emotionally while still standing right in front of everyone. As Kurt aged, the world around him began to change in quieter, more unsettling ways. Not dramatic losses, but gradual shifts. Time becoming more noticeable. Energy becoming more precious. The realization that roles, once chosen freely, now came with the unspoken question of how many chances remained. Aging isn't frightening when you've lived recklessly. It's frightening when you've lived responsibly. Because responsibility creates unfinished business. Emotional conversations postponed. Grief delayed. Exhaustion ignored. You tell yourself you'll slow down later. You'll reflect later. You'll feel it later. Later becomes a dangerous word. At a certain point, later stops arriving. For Kurt Russell, the tragedy isn't about regret in the traditional sense. It's not about wishing he'd been louder, messier, or more famous. It's about realizing that an entire emotional vocabulary went unused. That strength became a habit so deep he never learned how to ask for comfort without feeling guilty. And guilt is heavy when you carry it quietly. There's also a fear that grows sharper with age, especially for men who've spent their lives being protectors. The fear of becoming the one who needs protecting. The fear of dependency. The fear of watching the people you love worry about you the way you once worried about them. For someone like Kurt Russell, that role reversal isn't just uncomfortable. It's destabilizing. Because if your entire sense of self is built around being capable, being needed, being dependable, what happens when your body slows down before your mind is ready? What happens when time asks you to surrender control? That's not something Hollywood prepares you for. It doesn't train men how to step down gently from strength. It only celebrates them while they're useful. So you learn to smile. You learn to deflect. You learn to keep things light. And inside, you carry a growing awareness that the chapter you're in doesn't come with applause. It comes with silence. At 74, Kurt Russell isn't facing a dramatic ending. He's facing something far more unsettling, a quiet reckoning. A moment where survival alone no longer feels like victory. Where being strong no longer feels like enough. Because strength without release becomes isolation. And isolation, even in a full house, can feel unbearable. The most heartbreaking part is that Kurt Russell did everything right. He worked hard. He stayed grounded. He loved deeply. He avoided the traps that destroyed so many others. And still, here he is, confronting a truth no amount of discipline can outrun. You can spend a lifetime being strong and still arrive at a place where you're tired of holding everything together. And the question that lingers now, heavier than any role he ever played, is one he was never trained to answer. If I stop being the strong one, will anyone know how to hold me? As the years move forward, something subtle begins to happen to men like Kurt Russell. The world doesn't take anything away all at once. It simply stops asking, stops calling as often, stops needing the same kind of strength. And for someone whose identity was built around being needed, that absence can feel louder than any criticism. There's a strange grief that comes with becoming invisible while still being admired. People still respect you. They still call you a legend. They still smile when they see you. But they no longer lean on you the way they once did. And when you've spent a lifetime being the one others lean on, that shift can feel like losing gravity. Kurt has always been careful about privacy, careful about what he shares, careful about not turning his inner life into spectacle. That restraint protected him for decades. It kept his family safe. It kept his image intact. It kept the noise out. But silence, when held for too long, begins to echo. At a certain age, the mind starts revisiting moments you thought you'd already survived. Not because you failed, but because you never processed them. Childhood pressures that were brushed aside. Decisions made out of duty rather than desire. Conversations postponed because there was always another responsibility waiting. You don't relive these moments with drama. You relive them quietly. Late at night. In between thoughts. In the pauses that grow longer with age. For Kurt Russell, aging isn't about fear of irrelevance. It's about confronting a lifetime of emotional discipline and asking whether there was room left for softness. Whether the man who carried everyone else ever learned how to be carried himself. And that question becomes sharper when you think about family. When you realize that the role you played for decades is changing. Children grow older. Partners grow more independent. The protector slowly becomes the one people watch more closely, not because he's weak, but because time has made him precious. Being precious is not the same as being powerful. And that transition is brutal for men who were never taught how to let go. There's also the quiet awareness that comes with age that no one talks about honestly. The awareness that loss is no longer hypothetical. That goodbyes are no longer abstract. That the people who define your life are no longer guaranteed fixtures in your future. For someone who has always kept control through strength, this is the ultimate surrender. You can't outwork time. You can't perform your way past it. You can't stay disciplined enough to stop it from moving forward. You can only feel it. And feeling has never been Kurt Russell's public language. So instead, he does what strong men often do. He stays composed. He stays warm. He stays present. He makes others comfortable. He keeps the mood light. He avoids burdening anyone with the weight he's been carrying for years. But comfort, when it only flows outward, leaves the giver empty. The tragedy here is not loneliness in the obvious sense. Kurt Russell is not alone. He is surrounded by people who love him. He is respected. He is admired. He is remembered. The tragedy is emotional solitude. It's being surrounded and still feeling unheld. It's being celebrated and still feeling unseen. It's being known as an image while the inner life remains untouched. At 74, the most difficult thing Kurt Russell faces is not the end of a career or the loss of relevance. It's the realization that strength has protected him so well that it may have also isolated him. That by becoming the man who never broke, he never gave others permission to truly see him when he needed help the most. And that realization doesn't arrive with tears. It arrives with stillness, with the sense that something important was postponed for too long, that a part of himself stayed on hold while life kept moving, that surviving, while admirable, is not the same as being fully known. This is the quiet heartbreak no one prepares you for, the kind that doesn't look like tragedy from the outside, the kind that doesn't earn sympathy because it wears the face of success. Kurt Russell didn't lose everything. He carried everything. And now, standing in the later years of his life, the weight of that endurance is finally being felt, not as pain, but as a question that refuses to disappear. Was being strong enough if it meant never being held? And the most painful truth of all is this. Sometimes the greatest tragedy isn't falling apart. It's holding yourself together for so long that you forget how to let go. At this point, the quiet tragedy of Kurt Russell's life is no longer just about the weight of time. It's about the understanding that his entire career, his entire existence in Hollywood, has been about survival, not living. And when you've survived everything, you start asking a question no one teaches you how to answer. Is this all there is? For decades, he's carried the mantle of strength, of stoicism, the strong man in every role, the stable figure at home, the guy who made it look effortless. But now, standing at 74, the cost of that mask is undeniable. The face that the world admired, the one that seemed invincible, has slowly cracked, but not in the dramatic, headline-worthy way that we've seen with so many others. Kurt's cracks don't appear in public. They don't unfold in front of cameras or crowds. They appear when the cameras are off. They appear when the doors are closed, and the world forgets to ask how he's feeling, because they think they already know. This is the thing no one tells you when you become a symbol. You stop being a person. You stop being allowed to be human. When you live your whole life holding everything together, you begin to wonder if you're even capable of breaking, if the pieces can fall apart in a way that allows others to see your pain. There's no public moment for Kurt Russell's downfall. His tragedy is quiet, slow, and painful in a way that doesn't demand attention. He didn't burn out, and he didn't destroy himself in the public eye. He simply faded, not in the way we expect, not in a collapse or a crisis, but in the way all of us do, eventually, when we carry too much for too long. And now, at 74, Kurt faces the harshest truth of all. Surviving isn't living. Surviving is existing. There's a difference. For someone who is trained to perform and endure, the realization that strength alone isn't enough to keep you whole is a painful one. He was never taught to lean on others. He was never taught to let go. He was never taught to allow himself to be seen. And now that the world is watching less and life is slowing down, he's left with a deep sense of isolation. Not because he's alone, but because no one ever taught him how to ask for help. No one taught him that being strong doesn't mean always standing up. It means knowing when to ask someone to hold you up too. Kurt Russell has spent a lifetime building an image of the indestructible man, the guy who could survive anything, no matter the cost. But the hardest truth for him to face now is that survival was never the goal. It was just the means to an end. He made it to the end. But what comes next? What happens when you've reached the point where you've survived everything, but feel like you haven't lived anything at all? That's the moment of reckoning. That's the moment where Kurt Russell's true tragedy lies. Not in the things he lost, not in the roles he played, but in the emotional cost of never being allowed to break. Never being allowed to ask for help. Never being allowed to be human in front of the world that always expected him to be strong. And now, as he faces his 74th year, Kurt Russell is left with a question that can never be fully answered. Was it worth it? To survive so much, to live in silence for so long, to build a life on strength, and yet never ask for the love, the tenderness, the support he needed. And in the quiet hours, when he's finally alone with his thoughts, does he wonder if the life he lived, filled with so much success, so much admiration, so much control, was truly the life he wanted? The man who never needed to ask for help. The man who was always expected to carry others. The man who spent his entire life surviving. At 74, Kurt Russell doesn't just face the reality of age. He faces the reality of who he was allowed to be. And the scariest part of all? It's never too late to learn to let go. But sometimes, you've already carried so much, you don't know how to. Sometimes, it's too late to be the person you never let yourself be. The world may still view Kurt Russell as the unshakable star, an icon, a survivor, a man who faced down Hollywood's storms without ever letting the public see the cracks. But within the quiet space of his life, where no cameras flash and no interviews are conducted, there's a far different story unfolding. It's the story of a man who spent a lifetime building walls around his emotions, only to realize that those very walls have now become his prison. For Kurt, the toughest part isn't just the passage of time or the slow fade from the spotlight. It's the realization that despite all the adoration, despite the decades of career success, despite a loving partner and family, he is, in many ways, still alone. Not in a physical sense, but emotionally. The man who once embodied strength in every role now finds himself asking questions he never thought he'd have to answer. What happens when you can't be the Rock anymore? What happens when you've been the one people lean on for so long, but you have no one to lean on yourself? There's an invisible exhaustion that comes with being the strong one, the one who holds everyone else up without asking for help. And it's not until the end of a long journey, when the applause fades and the roles slow down, that you realize how heavy the burden of never letting anyone see you struggle truly is. Kurt Russell's tragedy is that he never had the chance to learn how to ask for support, because he was always the one giving it. In a world that demands invincibility from its stars, he learned to survive by hiding his vulnerabilities. He became a master at pretending to be fine, at masking the pain, at carrying on despite the emotional toll. But the cost of that is steep. What happens when the role of strong man becomes the only role you know how to play? What happens when the armor you've worn so long begins to feel too heavy, but you've forgotten how to take it off? The world never saw Kurt Russell's struggles because he never showed them. He made a life out of surviving, out of being the dependable one. But the price of that is something no one talks about. The cost of feeling unseen, of never being allowed to truly break down. And when you spend your life as a figure of strength, it becomes terrifying to admit that you're tired, that you need someone to care for you in the same way you've always cared for others. As Kurt reflects on his life at 74, the questions must be piercing. Was all of this career, this public image, this survival, worth the price he paid? Did he miss the chance to be truly alive because he was always too focused on being strong? There's a melancholy beauty in the way Kurt Russell shaped his life. He didn't fall victim to the same pitfalls as so many other stars, yet in some ways, that made his journey even more heartbreaking. Because surviving isn't living, and living is more than just enduring through the hardships. It's allowing yourself to experience joy, vulnerability, and connection, not just for the world, but for yourself. And now, at 74, Kurt must ask the most difficult question of all. How do I allow myself to be human when I've spent so much of my life trying to be something more? The answer isn't simple. It's a slow process of unlearning the habits of a lifetime. But it's also the key to healing, to finally letting go of the role he's played for so long, to accepting that he doesn't always have to be the Rock. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of all isn't that Kurt Russell has carried the weight of his career, his family, and his public persona. It's that for so long, he didn't know how to ask for someone to help him carry it too. And as he faces the reality of his later years, the question that lingers is no longer about fame or success. It's about something far more profound. Can I finally let go? Can I allow myself to be held? That is the quiet heartbreak of Kurt Russell's life. And in some ways, it's a heartbreak shared by all of us. Because at the end of it all, we all need to be held, to be seen, to be loved, not for the roles we play, but for the people we are. In the quiet spaces of life, when the applause stops, the camera fades, and the fame becomes a distant memory, the truth settles in. For Kurt Russell, That truth is confronting the parts of himself he kept hidden. The parts that never had a chance to be seen, the parts that he denied because he was always too busy being strong for everyone else. But now, in his later years, those hidden pieces of him begin to surface. Not in a dramatic unraveling, but in the soft realization that it's okay to not be okay. It's okay to not have the answers all the time. It's okay to be vulnerable, even when the world expects you to be perfect. The greatest tragedy of Kurt's life is not his career, but the emotional cost of never truly being allowed to feel his pain. For a man whose image has always been one of invincibility, the weight of that silence becomes suffocating as time goes on. What happens when the invincible man is finally faced with the fact that he is not invincible? The emotional toll of never showing weakness is profound. For years, Kurt has been the one who gave, the one who showed up, the one who smiled, even when he didn't feel like it. But now, at 74, there is a reckoning. The truth that has been buried deep inside begins to press against the walls he built around it. What happens when you realize that no matter how much you gave, no one can ever fully understand the burden of carrying everything alone? This is the part of Kurt's journey that is often overlooked. The part that isn't captured in films or interviews. The part that doesn't make headlines. It's the quiet realization that, for all the love he's given, all the stability he's provided, he spent a lifetime isolated in his own strength. And this isolation isn't something he chose, but something he was taught. From a young age, Kurt learned that being strong meant being independent, being self-sufficient. The idea that needing others might be seen as weakness never really crossed his mind. He was taught to be the one who helped, the one who carried, the one who never complained. But at 74, the weight of that lesson becomes clear. Strength is not about carrying everything by yourself. It's about knowing when to lean on others. It's about realizing that the people who love you don't want to see you suffer in silence. They want to be there for you, just as you've been there for them. And this is where Kurt's tragedy turns into something more universal. Because his story isn't just about fame or the burden of being a public figure. It's about the human experience of needing connection, of needing support, of needing to be seen, not for your accomplishments, but for who you really are. The painful truth for Kurt Russell is that, despite his success, despite his career, despite the admiration, there's a deep yearning to be more than just the strong one. There's a longing to be the one who can feel without needing to hide it. There's a desire to be held, not just praised. But asking for that help, asking for that comfort feels foreign. It feels like breaking the very persona that he's spent his entire life constructing. And yet, in his quiet moments, when the world isn't watching, the weight of that persona becomes unbearable. The truth is, Kurt Russell isn't just an actor. He's a man who, like all of us, has struggled with the pressure of always having to be fine. He's a man who, despite all his success, has carried the invisible weight of emotional solitude. And at 74, that weight is beginning to show. The question is, what happens now? What does a man do when he finally admits he needs something more than strength? What does he do when he realizes that survival isn't enough? That surviving a career, surviving fame, surviving family, surviving life itself is no longer the goal? The answer is not something Kurt Russell can find in his film roles. It's not something that can be scripted or planned. It's the uncharted territory of emotional vulnerability, the part of life that no one prepares you for. But maybe, just maybe, that's where the real victory lies. The ability to let go. The ability to be honest, to admit that sometimes we all need to be held. To admit that even the strongest among us need help. To admit that it's okay to finally break free from the roles we've been cast into for so long. Because in the end, strength isn't about never breaking. It's about knowing when to let someone else help you carry the weight. And for Kurt, maybe that's the hardest lesson of all. To realize that strength isn't just about standing tall. It's about standing together. And the most profound part of his journey is learning that it's never too late to ask for help. Never too late to break down the walls. Never too late to say, I can't do this alone anymore. As the years press on, Kurt Russell, like so many others, must face the quiet loneliness that often accompanies growing older. Despite all his triumphs, his roles, his legacy, there remains a shadow cast by something much deeper than professional success. It's the shadow of all the emotions left unspoken, of all the moments he never allowed himself to experience fully, because he was too busy playing the role of the unbreakable one. The reality he faces now isn't just about aging. It's about the final confrontation with the choices he made in order to protect himself and the people around him. Throughout his career, Kurt was the quintessential strong, dependable man. He was the one who carried the weight of every character he played and every role he inhabited. He built a life on this strength, becoming the guy who could be counted on, the one who never faltered, never cracked. The world saw him as a symbol of resilience, but behind that symbol was a man who learned early that showing weakness was dangerous. But as Kurt Russell approaches his 74th year, the inevitable truth begins to settle in. All of those years of being the unshakable one, of being the person others could always depend on, now feel like a double-edged sword. The very strength that made him a household name is now the thing that makes him feel isolated. The silence he kept around his emotions, the refusal to ever show that he was tired or hurting, has now become a burden he must bear alone. And the cruel irony is that strength, when relied on for too long, can become a prison. It becomes a cage that traps you, even as you try to escape it. Because when you're the one everyone turns to, when you're the person others rely on for comfort, for stability, you never have the luxury of falling apart. You don't have the space to feel everything, to process the emotions, to allow yourself to break down. You don't have the space to just be human. The hardest thing Kurt Russell must now face is that he's never been allowed to be truly vulnerable. He's never been allowed to experience the full range of emotions without the weight of expectation bearing down on him. And in his quieter moments, away from the public eye, away from the cameras and the fame, he must come to terms with the reality that he, too, is human. He is allowed to be tired. He is allowed to seek comfort. He is allowed to need support. But that realization doesn't come easily. For someone who has spent a lifetime building a facade of invincibility, it is a terrifying thing to finally admit that you need someone to catch you when you fall. And that admission doesn't come with fanfare. It doesn't come with applause. It's a quiet understanding that starts to take root in his heart, a growing awareness that surviving isn't the same as living, that no amount of external strength can fill the internal void of not being seen for who you really are. Kurt Russell has spent so many years trying to be everything for everyone else that he's forgotten how to be everything for himself. The tragedy is not that he is alone in his old age. The tragedy is that, despite all his success, all his relationships, all the accolades he's received, he still feels like he's carrying an emotional weight no one knows about. It's the weight of all the times he didn't allow himself to be vulnerable, the times he didn't allow himself to feel, the times he chose to be the strong one instead of the human one. Now at 74, Kurt Russell stands at a crossroads. He faces the difficult, painful realization that the role he's played for so long, both in Hollywood and in his personal life, is no longer one he can continue to sustain. The emotional walls he's built around himself have begun to crack. And though the world may still see the strong, dependable Kurt Russell, the man who's always been able to withstand the pressure, he knows the truth. He knows that strength can only carry him so far. Eventually, even the strongest person must ask for help. They must allow themselves to be seen as fragile, to be seen as needing care, just as much as they've cared for others. The final tragedy of Kurt Russell's life is not one of loss, but of revelation. It's the understanding that, despite all the accomplishments, despite all the love and admiration, he's never truly allowed himself to be seen for who he really is. The person who needs love. The person who needs comfort. The person who needs to break free from the expectations he's carried for so long. And that revelation, that painful awakening, is where the true healing begins. Because in the end, strength isn't about being unbreakable. It's about knowing when to ask for help. It's about allowing yourself to be human, to admit your weaknesses, to ask for love and support when you need it most. At 74, Kurt Russell's journey isn't over, but it's clear that the hardest part is still ahead. Learning to let go, learning to feel, learning that, after all these years of being strong for everyone else, it's finally his turn to be held.